Is Jiang a propaganda voice from the CCP, or is he a man with thoughts? One thing is clear to me is that his current opinions, as of this week, aligns with the Chinese Communist Party.
Unfortunately, it is the nature of the Chinese government not to interfere in foreign affairs. China doesn't really have a geopolitical framework, a grand strategy. It really believes in global trade.
China does, in fact, have a foreign intervention policy. Let's just take a look at some of the examples. Economic leverage, restricting trade or tourism to pressure countries like Australia, South Korea, Lithuania, because they said something that the CCP didn't agree with. How about Let's talk about the second one, political influence, funding lobbying in the US or other countries, shaping narratives abroad using what's called the United Front activities. And these essentially are like influencing the Chinese diaspora communities in local areas from the grassroots level to the elites they essentially have an entire system called the Political People's Consultative Conference dedicated to capturing Chinese abroad to serve the CCP's interests. You have soft powers, right? This campaign against Taiwan, where they're actively invading Taiwan, trying to turn their lawmakers, trying to appeal to the Taiwanese that the mainland version of China is the better one.
So what I would do is basically sit down everyone, okay, including Russia, China, Iran, and say it's time for a new world order where we are partners in this relationship. Right before America was the hegemon, before the U.S. dollar was the world reserve currency, but now what we want to do is open a dialogue where everyone is respected, where America is no longer the bully, but a willing partner in creating a new economic order that benefits everyone and not just a few.
Here, you have Professor Jiang again repeats something that we've heard before, community of common destiny of mankind. And that's essentially a Xi Jinping favorite slogan to say, even though he doesn't explicitly say that. But when he says a new world order with the likes of Russia, China, Iran, and the US, that's essentially the same version of the CCP, saying that the world is big enough to have both China and the US be global leaders. A world where the CCP sits equally at making decisions just as the US can. Multipolarity or whatever the terms, right? This is the stuff, whatever it's being called now, that's the idea. So this is the stuff that the CCP think tanks out of Beijing and universities in China have been telling the world since at least 2010s. So who exactly is Professor Jiang? Is he a deliberate psyop, or is he just playing into the hands of the CCP because of the things he believed in? So today, let's do a deep dive into his story. Now, the disclaimer here I want to make is I know people may think that he's made some really good guesses, predictions, and some of them came true, like how Trump was elected in 2024, how he predicted that Iran was going to be the next war, and perhaps even things going forward. My point is, I don't necessarily think that Jiang was a spy to begin with. However, in his current stance on things, his current role, the main purpose is to paint a Western world that is run by some secret organizations and somehow that the US is on its way to fail, when the reality has been the opposite. You can call it painting doom on US-led world order, or this idea of a defeat, like a America must be defeated mindset. Whatever it is, even if he's not a propagandist for the CCP, his actions of painting this picture that the West is inevitably going to fail plays right into the hands of China, who has been calling for this idea of the rising East and the fallen West, right? The entire ambition of the Xi sort of era has been that America is declining, or has declined. China is rising. Unfortunately, we've seen the opposite in reality, right? So this idea, or the goal of it, to discredit the Western world and calling it a conspiracy-driven state, these kind of things. One thing that inspired me to talk about this topic finally, even though I've done a few shorts on this, was the recent Tucker Carlson interview, as well as something a Chinese YouTuber had told me recently. I'll just read you what he said, okay? So here's what he said. He says that today I was scrolling through Chinese social media and it honestly felt like a parallel universe. What's strange is that most people can bypass the firewall and see major overseas information, but they end up with opposite conclusions. The general narrative goes like this. The US is bogged down in war, its allies are distancing themselves, and it's isolated and losing support. Israel is being heavily bombed and is overwhelmed by Iran's proxy, Hezbollah, barely able to cope. And meanwhile, Iran is united, it's organized, and it's steadily escalating with one major moves after another. And here's what I said, okay? I said that, okay, some of them climb over the firewall, scale the firewall just to browse still the same pro-China propaganda accounts. And he replied that, but that's not entirely true. He says a lot of what they cite actually comes from the same mainstream sources, including major X accounts that we also follow. And yet they draw a hugely different conclusion and what he finds baffling. So for example, take the recent news about the US F-35s making an emergency landing. Sure, it's entirely possible it was attacked, but the plane landed safely and the pilot was okay, unharmed. After 3 weeks of what's basically a large-scale conflict, this is the first time one side's aircraft has even been slightly damaged and forced to land. So by any reasonable standard, it's not a big deal. But on mainland Chinese social media accounts, it's full on the celebration. The feeds are flooded with comments like, the myth of American invincibility is shattered, or so this is the day that the US falls, or the once dominant US has actually been beaten by a third-rate country like Iran, and so on. They're looking at roughly the same information as we are, so why are their conclusions so completely different? He says, to me, it feels like long-term conditioning has created a kind of fixed thinking pattern, like a car that only has reverse gear. No matter what you load into it, once it starts moving, it can only go in the opposite direction. Now, I don't think everybody in China thinks like these comments that he's referring to, but I think the vast majority of people actually have this idea, just like Professor Jiang, that the inevitable decline of the West is coming, and it is coming so soon that they can pretty much pick every single piece of evidence from the news about that. Now, I think with the same mindset, you start to understand the stuff that's being said by Professor Jiang. I keep calling him a professor. He's not really a professor, but just for sake of clarity, Professor Jiang, he has the same access, perhaps even more, than the rest of the Chinese population, since he's native in English speaking, or at least fluent. Well, he has somehow still arrived, having been educated at Yale, the same conclusion as Chinese people in China. Could it be because he lives in China, he has the same informational environment around him? Somehow this, his theories started to align with the woke right crowd, which is this idea again, America is bound to fail, right? If you do anything outside of the country, it's going to fail, which again, it's contradictory to reality. So he in his channel, Predictive History, puts out videos that do have some correct predictions, as I said. But again, these are things that's jumbled in with ancient conspiracies, occult takes, and super confident prophecies, right? In general, will they actually be accurate? Well, only time can tell. But so far, what we've only seen are things like the surface stuff. Yes, Trump did go to war with Iran, but is it going to last 3 to 5 years as he predicts? I don't think so. Now, let's talk about the real question, right? Is he a CCP shill? He might be what we call the big foreign propaganda, which is a term given to individuals who has risen through prominence or has gained a lot of influence, but at the core of it promotes the CCP's interest while acting like they're not a part of the game. So what I'm telling you is essentially you have these Chinese accounts, sometimes Western accounts, that sounds like what they're saying is very non-biased. Sounds like they have no interest in the game, and yet at key critical moments, they will say something that sways the opinion of people on that thing in favor of China. So I'm very hesitant to fully say that that is the case. Again, I don't want to sound like I'm just simply attacking him. I'm not trying to. I'm just presenting the information as I see it, right? What I think happened was, I'll tell you the backstory of him very soon, but there was at some point a transformation in recent years that led him to start to say things that are aligning with China. So let's talk about his story. Jiang was born in 1976 in Taishan, which is in Guangdong province, southern province, speaking Cantonese. So according to his book, he, at the age of 6, moved to Canada, became a Canadian citizen, grew up in Toronto, speaking only English and Cantonese. In his book, he says he's never even realized that until much later that Mandarin and Cantonese were 2 separate languages. So in 1995, he enrolled at Yale as an English literature major, and he got to go to China for an internship as part of the late 90s sort of reform and opening up, and that was where he got his first internship to teach at a high school for a brief period of time. Now, in 2022, he was deported for allegedly spying for an American organization. What he was doing was filming for a documentary for PBS at the time, which is Public Broadcasting Service. And but his very first trip again was in 1998, and this is right after he was in Yale. And in his book, he again describes how he didn't really find the right people to talk and connect with. And then after he graduated from Yale, he actually moved to China and worked as a journalist and freelancer. And this is when he started to get into those trouble with the government in 2002. So you've had to just quickly summarize. In 1995, he went to Yale. 1998, did an internship in China. And then in 2002, while he was working for NGOs in China as a freelance journalist, he got deported. But then the question is, the stuff after 2000 or before 2008, 1999 to 2008, is barely mentioned in his book, which we'll talk about. But the point I want to make is nobody really knows what happened after he was deported because he ended up back in China in and around 2008. Okay, so during this time while he was in China or maybe around China, he had written a few articles that were at the time you could see that he was still very pro-West, pro-NGOs. His views were very interesting. So for example, in December of 2000, Jiang wrote this article in the Far Eastern Economic Review called Consuming Problem. He used tuberculosis patients to criticize China's healthcare system and push hard for NGOs to step in because the state can't handle it, which very interesting actually, because Chinese officials openly admitted that the pressure on the Chinese public healthcare system in the 1990s were very costly because there were so many people sick in China, and just relying on the state to handle that, it just wasn't possible. So he was stating some facts. And then September 2001, in an article called Fighting to Organize, he said that state-owned enterprise reforms were crushing workers and they needed to spontaneously organize. And so you hear these terms, people are going to be like, oh, this guy sounds like he was actually trying to start a color revolution in China. So far, these are quite Western thoughts, right? It doesn't sound like somebody from China would grow up wanting to do, you know? February 2002, in an article called The Nation, same vibe here, just more details. He basically eventually got trouble with the government while he was filming for PBS. And it's very interesting because from 2002 to 2008, it doesn't seem like he was in China, but when 2008 rolled around, Jiang officially started to teach at Shenzhen Middle School at the principal's request. The principal's name was Wang Zheng. He was the former vice principal of Peking University-affiliated high school, which is that same place that Jiang initially interned in 1998. By 2014, after the CCP got rid of a bunch of these foreign NGOs, or kicked them out basically, he disappeared. And then in 2024, Jiang launches the Predictive History on YouTube, drops basically this idea of focus on prophetic Middle Eastern and Iran forecasts, and at the time, obviously gaining a lot of traction. But here's where things get very interesting, okay? So the CCP-aligned propagandists think that Jiang is a CIA asset, and the people like us on the internet think that Jiang is a CCP propagandist. So the CCP guys, in fact, arrived at the same conclusion as us, or as I, which is that he is a big foreign propaganda, except they obviously think he's from the CIA, which tells 90% of the truth, sneaks in 10% of the lies, whereas I think it's the complete opposite because I don't think he's from the CIA. He does this for China, right? So who exactly is he working for? Nobody really knows. And I think clearly, you know, in China, you can't criticize the government and be allowed to do something like this for so long. And he does this on YouTube, right? So he's not popular in China, but he does this on YouTube, which is a platform that obviously you can't access, but he's a Canadian citizen, so technically you could. But again, if you look at any of his videos, he never criticized China in a big way, in a way that could get him into trouble, or just in ways where he actually openly offers these criticisms directly against the government, right? In 2017, he wrote in a CNN article column that China's firewall of censorship and state media apparatus not having a free press enables tyranny and corruption. Okay, while this is true, the so-called criticisms read the same as if it was written by a scholar from the Brookings Institution, and when they put out something criticizing China, you know, it's like a slap on the wrist, like a gentle tap. Not to mention his articles being featured on China's Youth League paper, which is a state media, so that's something that's very interesting because not everybody gets to feature in these. In these 2014 columns, Jiang repeatedly discussed educational reforms in pursuit of more Western-style education, none of which is too offensive in the eyes of the regime. But you know, coupled with it is that there's nothing critical of the government, right? It simply just exists. And 3 years before that, in 2011, Jiang was even featured again, this time after he wrote in the New York Times. He compares how the Chinese education system breeds test takers and not independent thinkers. And this was before Xi Jinping came into power. So since then, we haven't seen him write anything after 2017. But again, if you had to guess, up until lately, Jiang kept his opinion on China relatively low-key. It wasn't until he got more attention in the recent days in the English space that then he started to talk slowly about China. But again, it's like you have to build a credible background first, right? You have to do it for people to be able to trust you and listen to you, and then you slowly introduce what needs to get across about China. And so he seems to be working as an English philosophy teacher at something called a Moonshot Academy based in Beijing. This private school in the district of Chaoyang, which is a pretty prominent area. And in 2012, it was called Tsinghua High School, or affiliated high school. Then it was called Clear Forest School, and then it became Moonshot. The school teaches AP classes along with regular classes. It has a dual scoring system based on GPA, and also its own Moonshot system, which according to one student's account is very tiresome even for teachers to score students on. But in one video here, you see Jiang films 3 students that attends his class. They speak good English, like some of them even sound pretty native, I would say.
I really liked the Iliad already before the class, where I had read a simpler version, since it's a really popular book. And
yeah, like for the first question, I think with this course really gave me.
I think for the first question, what is the history that we learned from this class? I think firstly is that.
So that high school clearly has an English program. The tuition for the school annually is 238,000 yuan, or converted to USD, $35,000 per year. That's like a college degree or a college tuition, you know. So I believe the target student group is for high end of the medium class or middle class to the high income earners in China. Not necessarily, you know, the CCP officials, their offsprings, but more like a high end for the middle class or the high class people, you know. So going by the general trend of the Chinese people's views, Jiang is teaching students the same stuff, but with more misinformation attached. For example, Jiang believes that the Second Punic War never existed. Hannibal wasn't a real person. He claims that the US will put boots on the ground and institute a draft, which will lead to a civil war because National Guards will be deployed in every state. Meanwhile, he also says the Iranian war might end up being, you know, this 3 to 5 years thing, when in reality it could end in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And this stuff.
Wait a minute here. If the banks can print as much money as possible, why do we have poverty? Right? So that is the common answer, scarcity. We have poverty because of scarcity. But I already told you this. They can print money out of nothing.
Yeah, so let's just print money so that you and I and Elon Musk have the same amount of money, but a loaf of bread costs $30 billion. That's inflation. That's not how printing money is going to solve poverty. You know, to me, this is just a whole bunch of madness, messiness in a punch bowl, where you take a ladle of the drink, it's got, you know, all sorts of different flavors mixed together, but the sprinkling of it, of this idea that the CCP is bad, but the US is worse. So let's have relative criticisms. If you're going to criticize the US, if you're going to criticize the CCP, you better criticize the US more. In reality, the role it serves is one that overall is very negative towards the US or Western world, but very positive towards the China or China-centric world, right? All right, let me know your thoughts in the comments about this Professor Jiang, or if you think what I'm saying is true or not, or if you have more details to provide, love to hear all that. Thank you very much for watching. And again, if you're watching on China Insider still, please go and subscribe to our new channels, David Zhang 360 and David on China. This is where we'll be posting more new videos in the coming weeks and months. Thank you again for watching. We'll see you next time.